All right, we are now moving on to topic 3, which is life processes in the cell. First thing we're going to look at is the 8 life functions. Remember, the way that we're going to remember the 8 life functions is that 3 are gents. In order to be considered living, you have to be able to do all of these. So a virus, for example, would not be considered living. First up, we start with an R. First R is respiration. Whenever we're going through the 8 life functions, what you always want to think about is a key term to help you remember that. Remember, our key term for respiration is going to be ATP. Another thing that's always going to be associated with respiration is going to be the mitochondria. That is going to be the organelle where cellular respiration takes place. Our next life function is regulation. Keywords for regulation are going to be to control. Also, coordinate could work there. Remember, if you look at that base, we actually have the word regulate. Next up, we have reproduction. We have not talked a lot about reproduction. We're actually on that unit right now. We'll continue talking about that later, but for right now, you just need to be able to identify reproduction, making offspring is one of those 8 life functions. After that, we have growth and repair, talking about an organism getting bigger or healing itself. Then we have excretion. Excretion is talking about getting rid of metabolic waste. After that, we have nutrition. Nutrition is talking about the intake of food. A lot of times we call that intake of food nutrients. Then we have transport. Transport is talking about moving materials around. Fancy word for moving materials around is going to be to circulate. Also remember, if we're talking about it in terms of a cell level, what we're talking about is a cell membrane. Cell membrane is going to control what can go in and out of the cell through active transport or passive transport. And our last word there is going to be synthesis. Synthesis means to build or to make. Synthesis could include something like synthesizing ATP, meaning making ATP. It could include something like photosynthesis, where an organism is capable of making its own food. It could also discuss synthesis of starch, where you put two glucose or you put sugar molecules together, simple sugar molecules together, in order to make a larger molecule like starch. All of these together, all the 8 life functions, that's going to be your metabolism. So in order to be considered living, you have to be capable of doing all 8 of those terms, the 3R gents. Next thing we have is all living things need to maintain homeostasis. Here we have that prefix homeo. Remember, homeo means same. Stasis, we're talking about stay. When we're talking about staying the same, what we're really referring to is the fact that we want balance, or another word we can have is dynamic equilibrium. What are some examples of homeostasis? One classic example is going to be body temperature. So whether it's really cold out or really hot out, your body is always going to be 98.6 degrees, roughly. So if it's really cold out and your body temperature starts to go lower, what do you start to do? You start to shiver. You start to get goosebumps. That's in order to conserve that heat. If it's really hot out, your body temperature, if it starts to increase a little bit, you start to sweat. And again, that would bring your body temperature back down to a 98.6. And if you were to look at it long term in graph, what you would see, slight increase, decrease, whereas your average throughout the day would be about 98.6. If we are going to go down the paper a little bit more, what we're going to see is how we organize life. And when we're talking about the organization of life, we're looking at from least complex to most complex. I will say for this question, always make sure that you look at the order they want it in, because it's not always least to most. Sometimes it's most to least. Now, least, remember, we're talking about the smallest structure that you can have. And then when we're talking about most, we're talking about the largest structure. There I have cell, organ, organelle, organism, and tissue. The teeniest, tiniest one that you can have is going to be your organelle. Remember, organelle really just means tiny organ. After organelle, then you're going to have cell, followed by tissue, organ, and then organism. Sometimes there's also going to be organ system. An organ system would go right in between your organ and your organism. Now, all organelles must coordinate activities to maintain homeostasis. What does coordinate mean? Coordinate really just fancy word for work together. And we've seen a little bit of that so far. Remember, we talked about the fact that for respiration, a cell's going to need glucose, it's going to need oxygen. Well, how does it get that glucose and oxygen? Glucose and oxygen is going to have to diffuse through the cell membrane and then get to the mitochondria, right? That's showing two cell organelles interacting and working together so the 8 life functions can occur. Single cell organisms contain organelles that carry out the life functions, and multicellular organisms do too. So something like a single cell could be a bacteria, and then a multicellular organism could be something like a human. Both of them have organelles. Multicellular have organs that carry out the 8 life functions as well. Scrolling down a bit, we have the major cell organelles that we are going to have to be familiar with. You should be able to identify them on a picture, and you should also be able to, if you just see them in a multiple choice, answer the multiple choice based on that. Now, instead of calling them an organelle, sometimes they do call them a structure. And then sometimes, instead of a function, they call it a process. Remember, it's really important that you're familiar with that type of terminology as well. First up, we have ribosome. Remember, ribosome has that prefix rib. When we're looking at that prefix rib, what I want you to think is, what are ribs made up of? Ribs are a type of meat, right? So that's going to be involved in protein synthesis. Next up, I have my nucleus. The nucleus is going to be our control center. It's going to be where all of our genetic information is. And remember, our genetic information is going to be our DNA. Next up, that's where I have my mighty mitochondria. The mighty mitochondria needs to be able to produce energy in the form of ATP. When we're talking about mitochondria, then, the life process that it's capable of doing is going to be cellular respiration. Sometimes you'll see it called aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is just taking into account that it needs oxygen in order to occur. And it makes ATP. Remember, ATP is a form of usable energy. When we're trying to identify this, let's say on a worksheet or a test or a quiz, what we're looking for is that circle with that little squiggly line inside of it. Remember, a lot of times I say that little squiggly line looks like a script M to me, and that's how I remember that it's the mitochondria. Next up, I have a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are only in plant cells, and they're responsible for photosynthesis. So let's write down photosynthesis in plants, because that is a life process that we as humans, other animals, we're not capable of doing that. Only plants can undergo photosynthesis. And the last one is the cell membrane. Cell membrane we just talked about in our last unit, and that's going to be responsible for transport. Transport means allowing for materials to go across the cell membrane, whether that be oxygen, carbon dioxide, or glucose. Then we have a picture. We have to be able to identify what all of these organelles are inside of the picture. If we look right here, A, that structure right there, that is my nucleus. That's where my DNA, my genes, and my chromosomes are going to be located. B, which is this inner line here, that's going to be my cell membrane. Remember, all organisms, plants, animals, bacteria, they all have a cell membrane there. And what's going on in that cell membrane? Oxygen, carbon dioxide, those molecules are able to diffuse across it or move across it. C is pointing to this empty space right here. That empty space is going to be a vacuole. Now, I don't have vacuole written down as one of the organelles you need to know, but remember, a vacuole is in charge of storage. It can store things like food and water for the cell for later. And then finally, if we're looking, we have D. D is this little black dot there. That little black dot is going to be your chloroplast. Now, that's not a great representation of it, but this is a type of picture that you would see on the region, so you should be familiar with it. One other thing to note is that if we're looking at this cell, okay, this is going to be an example of a plant cell. So I would label that here. Remember, plant cells, if we're talking about a generalized or kind of a typical plant cell, is going to have that square shape to it. The one other thing that I would note is that there's actually an outer layer to this plant cell, and that's going to be an organelle or a structure that's unique to the generalized plant cell. That is going to be my cell wall. All right, take 1 minute, try to go through the questions on the next page, and then we'll go over those answers. All right, looking at the first review question, it says one characteristic of all living things is that. So now we're looking for a trait that everything that's living is going to possess. This would include bacteria, plants, animals, yeast, fungi. So that means something that's a simple single-celled organism and then something that is also a multicellular organism. If you look at one, it says develop organ systems. That's not going to be a good answer because remember, things like bacteria, they don't have organ systems. They only have organelles. Number 2 says maintain internal stability. Maintain internal stability really means homeostasis. Therefore, all organisms need to make sure that their internal conditions remain constant regardless of the outside environment. That could be it. Now, if we look at number 3, it says produce identical offspring. That would mean clones. Not all organisms produce clones. Think about humans, for example. You're different from your parents. And then number 4 says synthesize only inorganic matter. No, we're not necessarily synthesizing inorganic matter. Think about plants, for example. They're able to synthesize organic matter in the form of starch and sugar. So best answer there is going to be 2. Number 1 says, which sequence best represents increasing complexity? Increasing complexity means we're going to start off with something that is small and then go to something that is larger. Number 1 says tissues, then cells, organelles. That's definitely not right. The smallest one that we're going to have there is organelles, so we can cross that one off. Number 2 says cells and then organelles. Once again, that's flip-flop, so I'd cross that one off. Number 3 says organelles, cells, tissues, and organs. Organelles are the smallest, and then cells are made up of organelles. Tissues are really just groups of cells, and then organs are groups of tissues. So that sounds like a good one. Number 4 says organism, cells, tissues, organelles. Organism is the most complex there, so that's definitely not the correct answer. The best answer choice there is going to be 3. Number 4 says, which statement best describes the organelles in a cell? Remember, the organelles are talking about the tiny structures inside of the cell that are capable of doing the 8 life functions. Those 3 are gens. If I'm looking down the list, number 1 says, all organelles are involved directly with the communication between cells. That's not going to be correct. 2 organelles that are involved would probably be the ribosome and the cell membrane. So we can cross that one off because not every single organelle is involved in that. Number 2 says organelles must work together and their activities must be coordinated. That means organelles are going to be working together in order to ensure that your cell's maintaining homeostasis. That sounds like it could be correct, but let's read the rest. Number 3 says organelles function only when there is a disruption in homeostasis. No, your organelles are working all the time. The whole reason why they're working is to ensure that you can maintain homeostasis. And then number 4 says each organelle must function independently. That means alone, without one another, in order to maintain homeostasis. And that is definitely not a good answer because every single organelle is going to have to work together in order to function properly. All right. If we're looking at the rest of those questions, kind of scrolling down, number 4 says structures in an animal cell are represented in the diagram below. My first thing that I would do is I would label all of these with the names. If I look over here for C, C is pointing to that little dot. That little dot is going to be my ribosome. B is pointing to that circle that has a little squiggly line in it. Remember that little squiggly line is supposed to remind you of a script M. That is going to be our mitochondria. And then A, which is the last one there, that's going to be my cell membrane. Now I know that that's the cell membrane because remember, this is an animal cell, and that's what's on the outside of an animal cell. With that information, what I would want to do is label each one of these boxes. Here where it says structure A, well, I just labeled A, the membrane. B, I label as the mitochondria. And then C is going to be my ribosome. Now I have to match all of these up with their correct function. So membrane, if I'm looking just in the membrane box, structure A, I have waste removal. Yeah, the membrane can be in charge of waste removal because it's going to remove things like carbon dioxide and water, which is produced as a byproduct of respiration. So that could be it. Information storage. No, if information storage isn't correct, information is stored inside of the nucleus in the form of DNA and chromosomes. 3, protein synthesis. No, protein synthesis is going to be the function of the ribosome. And then the last one says cell communication. Well, remember, the cell membrane does have receptors on it, so that could be correct. So now we can definitely cross off 2 and 3. Now we're left with either 1 or 4. If I look at structure B says mitochondria. Answer choice number 1 says extract energy from nutrients. Energy, remember, is ATP. Nutrients would be something like glucose. Yeah, that's actually the entire function of the mitochondria, right? To make usable energy in the form of ATP. Number 4 says transport of material. Transport of material is really limited to, let's say, endoplasmic reticulum, the cytoplasm, and the cell membrane. So that's probably not it. Let's look at the last one. Structure C says ribosome. Remember ribosome, whenever I see that, I circle that rib in order to prompt me, hey, we're talking about proteins here. So if I'm looking at the two answers, number 1 says protein synthesis. That sounds good. Number 4 says waste removal. And the protein ribosome is not getting rid of waste. So best answer choice there is going to be number 1.